All right, it's 8 a.m. We'll get started. And what we'll be doing today is we'll be taking a look at the next step in your review process. What you were supposed to have done for today is your decades association. And my hope is that while you were doing that activity, it gave you a chance to look at dozens of different events from U.S. history that we've covered throughout the course of the year, some more so than others, some might have stuck more than others. But I'm hoping that when you look them over, you were able to start grouping stuff into time periods. You were also able to assess for yourself how well do you actually have that content held together. Because with less than 3 weeks until our AP test, that's where we need to be. We need to be, first of all, really getting our content under control so that if we are thrown an essay question, we can load that essay question up with proper nouns, not fluffy generalities, but specific terms that we can use in our essay writing, that we can use as support inside of our essays. And in particular, when I think about the DBQs, I've now graded almost all of period two's DBQs. I'll be having the rest of them graded sometime today. And we'll be able to look at yours specifically tomorrow during the session that we'll be holding. But in particular, what I'm seeing a lot of people who are writing document-driven essays, which is essentially you relying on the documents for pretty much all of your information, and pretty much based on summaries, just document A says this, document B says this, which according to the rubric, it's going to be really hard for you to score well if that's all that you're bringing to the table. You may also find that with your essay writing, you may be having trouble under time limits trying to come up with what you're trying to say. Having your content automatic is going to be something that makes those essays easier to write. It's kind of like playing the piano, where when you watch a good pianist, they've got an actual feeling. And this is the same with all instrumentalists. They know where their fingers go. They know how to pull out certain notes from their instrument. So they don't need to keep looking down at their fingers to see how they plunk out notes. They're instead thinking about how they craft music, and they rely on some stuff to be automatic. Your content has to be that. And so if your content knowledge isn't strong enough to be able to bring a lot of facts to the essay that you're writing, you're in a pretty rough shape, because these essays are meant to catch kids who are only able to do brief document summaries. And it's meant to not reward them with getting college credit. And so we've got time to fix that up, especially with the review ideas that I had of using flashcards, study guides, online reviews, and the like. So let me first of all bring you to this. So here's today's activities that we're working on. Make sure you get your attendance done. Make sure you check out the online course schedule. We're supposed to be getting more information from the College Board tomorrow as far as details for when we can actually take you into the testing software and give you a chance to test drive it. Remember what we talked about yesterday? Chapters 40 and 41 notes are going to be pushed back to after the AP test is done. But remember, you've got this decades association that I do want you to upload into Schoology. Please use the Schoology link to turn this in so that you're able to get the credit for the work that you did. Then again, if you're not done yet, remember what we talked about yesterday. I want you to put down your best guesses first, then I want you to check your own work. So I want you to look online and figure out, what decade do each of these events have in common? So each of these events the events that you look at might span multiple decades, but in combination with all the other events that you have on the list, there should be one decade that fits for each of them, unless they're coming from colonial times. Today, though, what we're going to be taking a look at is, now that we've had a chance to kind of get your brain going as far as like specific names of proper nouns that could be used inside your essay writing, I want to bring you back to your essay question. And with your essay question, I want you to think about the essay that I had you write last Friday, because I'm seeing common mistakes that are popping up that are no different than any other year that I've taught this course. The only problem, and this is something that my wife and I were discussing last night, she's also a teacher. And so the two of us are wrestling with this time of year. And one of the things that's coming to my realization when I was talking to her last night is, we would typically at this time of year be doing in-class instruction and also after-school review activities And we'd be able to knock out stuff just inside conversations that would be able to keep us safe. Trying to get all of that stuff done in one session like this is not super easy to do, but we'll be all right. But when I think about like the essay question that you have right here, many kids are making the same mistakes when it comes to taking a look at this essay question. So the question says, evaluate the extent to which regional differences about slavery contributed to political tensions in the period from 1830 to 1861. The word that I think most kids ended up missing out on is this right here. I got a lot of essays where I had kids who were writing about like sectional tensions that were happening as a result of westward expansion. Totally great content to be able to throw into this essay, as long as you eventually bring it back and you're able to explain, did that have some sort of impact on political tensions? Or I had kids talking about the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison and how he was stirring people up in general, and never really getting back to the idea of, is he doing anything to impact political tensions? So when you think about the questions that you're going to be asked on the AP test, what we really need to get down to is this big idea. You cannot fail the AP test in the first few paragraphs, but you can totally set yourself up to limit your points if you don't do a thorough job planning out what you're going to be doing with your essay question. And in this case, I saw a lot of people whose points really topped out at like a 2, 3, 4, because of the fact that when it came to actually ATFQ, answering the full question, I had kids who were writing all sorts of fun facts about slavery during this time period, and being able to identify regional differences that were taking place and never actually get down to what impact did this have on political tensions of the time period. And what you can feel is that you used 45 minutes of your young, precious life, and you're never going to get that time back. But if you didn't focus on answering the full question, these tests are meant to catch you. And that's where you may find your points really limited. So when you take a look at the concept outline, I've walked you through the concept outline for the different time periods 3 through 7, which are eligible for the test. But when you look at an essay question, I want you to consider these things. First of all, they are going to be assessing a specific skill, but they will allow you opportunities to be able to flash any of these skills to earn some points on the AP test. But your questions will either be focusing on compare, contrast, cause and effect, continuity, and change. And if you look at this essay question, this is asking about cause and effect. How did these differences about slavery cause political tensions during this time period? When I flash you back to here then, and we're doing a cause and effect sort of question as we're working our way through, this type of question would then lend itself to being chronological in nature. And it's very much talking about a buildup of tension where this event happens, it impacts politics in this way. And then as a result, here's how tensions keep building until eventually you get to the Civil War. That type of chronology can be tricky, especially if you don't have your content knowledge as tight as you want it to be. So one of the tricks that I've taught you to use when it comes to essay questions like this is if they do give you dates 1830 to 1861, using your memorization of the presidents, their years in office, and their political parties could easily help, because if you did that in preparation for the DBQ, you would have noticed that we had a political party shift where our two-party system changed dramatically during the time period of this essay question, and that's what they were asking you to explore. If we go down here to themes, the other thing I need you to keep in mind is that you are working on a theme when they give you an essay question. There will always be a primary theme that is pegged to what is going on with the question itself. So you might be exploring American national identity, work and exchange of technology. This is your theme that you were supposed to be focusing on. How did different social and political groups this theme focuses on how different social and political groups have influenced society and government in the United States, as well as how political beliefs and institutions have changed over time. That is what they want to be exploring. This is one of the big threads that they're asserting is seen throughout U.S. history, that over time, we move from one time period to another, and as our values and our views and our issues change, our parties then have to shift along with that in order to try to create a majority that then can win political office. And they want you to be able to recognize that and be able to explain how that is taking place. So in the case of this essay question, they're asking you to be able to think through how political tensions grew as a result of slavery from 1830 to 1861. The document I would like you to play around with then is located on your Google document that I've been sharing with you. And what I would like you to please open up is this Political Parties Thematic Study Guide. Let me share, and I'll be able to put it into the chat over here as well. So if you could please open that up and have a notebook available, because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking a look at how political parties developed and changed over time. And then what I'd like you to do at the end of doing that review is I would like to be able to walk you through what a good essay response could look like with this DBQ, thinking about what's going on with the political parties. So if I bring you back to this PDF right here, you'll notice that there's different categories that are provided for you on this PDF. And what I'm going to throw at you is I'm going to give you a chance to try this out on your own. And then we will come back together and discuss what you see happening with this chart. So we'll work through it quickly with one another. But when you take a look at these groups, what I would like you to see is I would like you to run through, do you remember any of these categories? And the reason why I have you trying to do this on your own is I could just read off these answers for you. And if I did that, that would be very much what I did at the beginning of the school year. That's not retention. Retention is you actually test driving this information first. So I want you to look through and think, can you remember what the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans' goals and policies were, who was voting for them, and who were their major figures or leaders? Now, you may find that the major figures or leaders might be the easier one to do first, because if you think back to our beginnings, you probably remember Federalists and Democratic Republican presidents or influential Americans. But then you'll also remember that during this time period from 1787 till 1824, there was a shift that took place. And in particular, what I would like you to think about is, can you remember who the presidents were during this time period? Can you use the knowledge that we built up of what years they were in office to be able to help you to understand who these individuals were to make up what was known as our first party system? So this was the period where we created a two-party system, largely because the Electoral College demands that. You need to get a majority of the electoral vote, as you saw in elections like 1800 with the tie that took place between Jefferson and Burr. Or as you saw in 1824 with the corrupt bargain, where you had multiple individuals running. So see, looking down this list, if you can just mentally run through, I'll give you about a minute. If you can remember who supported, who were the major people, who supported which, and also what they wanted to achieve. Now, it is at this time also that if you've got a printer and you want to print this off, that we typically would do this activity as a hard copy written in class. Sadly, we're in different times. I tried to convert this PDF last night. It didn't go super hot. Take about 30 more seconds to jot down what you remember about any of these groups. So when you take a look at the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, what we want you to be noticing is in different time periods, political parties make more or less sense depending on what issues they're discussing. And sometimes when an issue is resolved, then parties become irrelevant at that point. So what I would make note of is when you take a look at our first party system, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans are debating how should the new Constitution be interpreted when it comes to the respect of political power and federal versus states' rights. So when we think about the different people that you had inside these groups, this is different than Federalists and Anti-Federalists during the Constitution. Sophia, you got it absolutely right. I didn't want to add in another device, but if you want to use Cami, it is an app that you guys can get onto your Chromebook. You can open it up once you download it, and then you can mark it up like crazy. That is a really good route to go. I was just a little bit scared about adding another technology onto you guys' plate, but it's a fantastic tool to use. So Federalists and Democratic Republicans were debating over the question of how do we interpret the Constitution. So if we think about their policies, first of all, loose versus strict constructionism for the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. And in particular, that battle over loose versus strict constructionism was during the period of the 1700s, during the Washington and the Adams presidency. So you've got Washington and Adams, who are the major figures during this time period. You're going to find that Washington and Adams are going to be supported also by Alexander Hamilton's views. And so the major policies that you have over here are like funding, assumption, the Bank of the United States. I'll just open up Cami so you guys can see what it looks like. And when we think about demographic support that you guys have when it comes to the groups that are supporting them, for the Federalists, they're largely located up in the Northeast. Meanwhile, Democratic Republicans are largely farmers, the common people. And as a result, they're going to be the ones who are very much troubled by Alexander Hamilton, Bank of the United States, and those sorts of things. Now, as you'll remember, the Federalist Party is going to drop out after the War of 1812. They're largely done winning national elections. And part of the reason why is the Democratic Republicans are benefiting from the 3/5 compromise. They get more political power in the Electoral College than they should. They're counting African Americans in the voting blocks. And as a result, they start winning presidential elections. The Federalists start questioning our involvement in the War of 1812. And finally, when we get to the period of the 1810s, 1820s, during the Madison and Monroe presidencies, we had what was known as the era of good feelings. The Federalists were gone. We had all Democratic Republicans until the election of 1824. The election of 1824 was known as the corrupt bargain. And the corrupt bargain was the one where Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams had very different visions over what the country should look like. This led to one president being part of the National Republicans, John Quincy Adams. And if you remember John Quincy Adams, he was a guy who came up with the Henry Clay American system, where he and Henry Clay were talking about like infrastructure and other sorts of things, a new bank in the United States. And Andrew Jackson hated the idea of all of that. So as we scan down to here, this is the era of your essay question. So your essay question was from 1830 to 1861. Analyze how regional differences about slavery contributed to political tensions. Many kids converted this into, I'm going to explain what caused the Civil War, which is something that's related, but you're changing the question into something easier for you to answer. This is instead asking, in 1828, we created a brand new Democratic Party, and the person at the head, the major figure, is going to be Andrew Jackson. Another major figure is going to be James K. Polk, who is known for Manifest Destiny. And what we want to be noticing when it comes to the major goals and policies is for Andrew Jackson, there isn't really a coherent model for what he believes in. In some cases, he believes in a strong central government, like you see in the nullification crisis. You also see, though, that he fights back against the Supreme Court when it came to the Trail of Tears. He is somebody who really aggressively kills the Bank of the United States. And so the dilemma that you have is that for Andrew Jackson, his policies aren't something that's coherent. He is a populist. He is a strong central leader who can rally the common folk. And so the people who support Andrew Jackson, largely farmers, the common folk of the West and the South. The people who are against Andrew Jackson, though, are known as the Whigs. And so we have a political party that's created during this time period that isn't really united by what they're for. They're united by what they're against. And so when we think about what's going on then with your essay question, a lot of the issues with slavery are going to then undermine the Whig Party that is going to be our major party in the mid-1800s. When we think about the Whigs then, some of them, like Henry Clay is a Whig, they would love to have the American system of transportation networks and whatever that could then help to build transportation and trade and a market revolution, just like you see in Document 6. You'll remember, though, Andrew Jackson totally hates the idea of having the national government doing a Bank of the United States or stepping in with these sorts of projects. So these projects are typically left to the states. The states then are going to be left up to private businesses. And when it comes to a private business and person who's building railroads, they're not building railroads to be fair to all the sections of the United States. They want to build a railroad in a place where people will actually use that railroad for transportation. And if your bet is either in the South with cotton plantations and very few cities, or the North that has cities and farms and manufacturing centers that all need to be interconnected, obviously they're going to be building more transportation up in the North. This will then increase trade in the North, increase wealth in the North, and there'll become a wealth disparity between the North and the South. Not really because of what the federal government forced anybody to do, but instead it's going to be something that creates tensions because the choice that the South has to rely on slavery will then make it so that railroads don't really see them as an attractive place to start building up. So when we take a look at these two political parties, the Democrats and the Whigs, and we think about your essay question that you were working with, for the Whigs, they've got these ideas about how they don't like Andrew Jackson. They're uniting people like Henry Clay, who belongs over here, Daniel Webster, but then you'll also have John C. Calhoun, who periodically will be a Whig because he and Andrew Jackson don't see eye to eye. You also had all of these new political parties that popped up, and the ones that I would like to highlight for you is you have the Liberty Party, which is the one that is created by William Lloyd Garrison. The Liberty Party is going to be focused on the idea of ending slavery immediately. But one of the side stories that we talked about in class is that most Americans were nervous about how radical William Lloyd Garrison was. And then he got turned off to politics in 1844 because his work in New York in the burned over region during the Second Great Awakening actually took votes away from Henry Clay in 1844 and helped get James K. Polk elected, which led to massive expansions out in the Western frontier that could be opened up for slavery. For you then, what I want you to be thinking about is when you wrote your DBQ, there's probably some of you who are having your head spin right now where it's like, holy cow, that's a lot of political details that I was supposed to be holding on to. This is totally the way that the DBQ works. So if you're finding that with your content review, you haven't gone into this sort of dive yet, that's what the next few weeks needs to be working on building up. I wish I could say it was easy, and it's much easier when I have you guys at school in class or being able to talk to you during our after school review sessions, because being left on your own at home, you may be getting a false sense of security with the idea that you're doing just fine, having taken your notes, read your stuff, and whatever. That level of detail is what they're looking for inside this writing, or at least understanding that with the acquisition of like Texas during the Jackson presidency, that's going to be what tears the Whigs apart in 1844. You have a new party called the Free Soil Party that also emerges, and that's what you have here in document 3. This is the Wilmot Proviso, and this is where a lot of kids ended up getting really crossed up, because what's going on with the Wilmot Proviso is during this Mexican-American War, David Wilmot kept putting provisions into the bills to pay for the Mexican-American War, where he was saying that in order to get this money, you have to promise that slavery will not be allowed to move out west. But it mentions here that he isn't somebody who is like super sympathetic with the slaves, and he is not somebody who is an abolitionist. He is a free soiler. He does not want African Americans to move out into this territory either free or as slaves. He's something different. Now, what we want to be noticing is we've also got the Know Nothing Party that is anti-immigrant, or the anti-Masonic Party that is popping up that's worried about secret societies. But the dominant issue during this time period is slavery. And let me run you through some events that you could easily talk about, because of the fact that when we were talking about this time period, we talked about manifest destiny, which totally could show up in this essay question. But what we talked about is that when we conquered new territory, that made people feel nationalistic pride, but there was also a sectionalistic division that was taking place between North and South as they fought over adding states. And in fact, we had a balancing act going on with Missouri and Maine during the Missouri Compromise, where we had added one free, one slave state to the Congress, and it was particularly to maintain balance in the Senate. We were doing that because of the fact that in the House of Representatives, the South had the Three-Fifths Compromise, but the North had immigrants and urbanization. And we talked about in class how the turning point for this whole time period politically was the Mexican-American War and the Compromise of 1850, which totally should have been in your essays if you were looking at what was happening politically. The Compromise of 1850 added California to the United States. It also introduced the idea of popular sovereignty, which the Democrats liked because it would then give people the right to vote on whether or not they were going to have slavery. It also added in a Fugitive Slave Act. And this is where you have document 4. Many kids summarized this document and said, this document is making slavery illegal in New Hampshire. It's expressly doing that and other things. This law right here is being created in response to the Fugitive Slave Act. You would have slaves run away to New Hampshire. You'd have slave catchers who would go into New Hampshire. You'd have abolitionists who would say, look, my religion says I can't round up slaves. And this is putting into law an announcement, not just that slavery is illegal in the state, but if you come into the state, whether it's voluntarily or involuntarily, you are free. And then if you try to hold somebody in slavery, which means if you're a bounty hunter and you try to come and get a slave and return them to slavery, you will be convicted of a felony and you yourself will be thrown in prison. This is the state of New Hampshire working to nullify the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, for many of you guys, it just boiled down to a straight summary of what this document is saying. They're looking for more. And that's the key when you're looking at what's going on with this essay question. And it's the reason why I've given you this thematic review. If you remember, in the 1850s and 1860s, you then enter into your third political party era, where you have a battle going on between Republicans and Democrats. And the Democrats, as you see here with demographic support, Democrats are in both the North and the South, but they become primarily the party of the South. Republicans only have support in the North, and that's Abe Lincoln, Stephen Douglas, and they have battles during the 1850s. Kansas-Nebraska Act is what splits these two up. The Dred Scott case splits these two up. the John Brown decision, the caning of Sumner, and other sorts of things that you don't find anywhere inside of this DBQ. All of that could be outside information. But essentially, what this essay question is trying to get to is how did we go from the period of Democrats and Whigs exiting the era of good feelings? What impact did slavery and the debate over slavery have to take us from here to here, Democrats versus Whigs compared to Democrats versus Republicans, and a civil war? If you found yourself heavily reliant on the documents, then the documents will give you enough support to be able to guide you to certain places. But notice the gaps of knowledge that are left inside the documents. They'll give you a document here of David Wilmot, and they're trying to get you to reference the Mexican-American War and his funding of that war, and that's not anywhere inside this document. They're leaving you space between this and this document to be able to talk about the Compromise of 1850 so that you're able to go into detail about how it too caused tensions because it was a battle over slavery and its expansion, and it did have a major impact on our political tensions because in 1850 the South was thinking about seceding, and they're able to hold that off with Henry Clay and Stephen Douglas coming up with a compromise to hold the country together. As you look down these documents here, then, when you look at George Fitzhugh talking about what's going on in the South, many of you guys gave a really good summary about how this document is saying that the South, with its slaveholding, has advantages over the way that factory workers are treated in the North in the industrial system. The big question, though, when it comes to that sort of document analysis is, so what? What does that actually have to do with the essay question about how regional differences about slavery contributed to political tensions? When you take a look at this document, you could easily talk about this story of how the South is great. There are no mobs, there are no trade unions, there's no jealousy, there's none of that sort of stuff. And they leave a gigantic gap between here and here, where you could easily put an analysis of Uncle Tom's Cabin refuting this sort of viewpoint. You could talk about how John C. Calhoun called this not a necessary evil, but a positive good. The key, though, is to bring these documents back to your question. You can't just summarize them and say what George Fitzhugh is saying is that slavery is better than the Northern system. It's great that you can read, comprehend, and summarize. They're looking for more. And in particular, what I'd like to do is I'd like to bring you back to these skills where if you think that this is what's being asked of you is hard, it is absolutely super hard what you're being asked to do. We started off this year where they wanted us at the beginning of the year to work on this category in your thinking skills. Can you identify a historical concept? Can you explain it? We then worked throughout the course of the year to read like primary and secondary documents and identify claims that are being made. But if all you can do is summarize, you're right here in the process, they want you to get down to this level down here. Where with your writing, they don't just want you to summarize, they want you to do more. So if it feels like I'm picking on you, if when I point out you can't just summarize what Fitzhugh's main point is, that doesn't mean you should do it. It's just for many of you guys, that's where you're stopping. And instead, we need to take it further. And your key question is ATFQ. So like I've mentioned to you throughout the entire year, whenever you're writing a document-based question, if you're using a document, it's not good enough just to summarize it. Have you done anything to actually answer this question with the analysis that you've been providing? So when you get your rubrics back, like I mentioned, today will be when I finish up grading. I've finished up probably 2/3 of the essays at this point. The other third I'll be doing on this rainy day where I'm trapped inside and not able to enjoy sunlight or whatever. Perfect DBQ grading weather. You should be able to see your results coming back soon. And then what I would like to highlight for you is this. You've got on your instructions for today 5 different thematic outlines. So when you take a look at these thematic outlines, the only time periods that you need to worry about are periods 3 through 8 when it comes to the actual DBQs you'll be writing. Remember, though, you can use early and late stuff outside the time period as contextualization. So I would look down this study chart and the others I've provided for you and see if there's anything that you need clarification with. Think about the idea, though, that when you're going down this list, you should be working skills. So the skills that you're asked to do is compare contrast. Can you compare and contrast the political parties of the Jacksonian era with the issues that are being debated during the Gilded Age? They're different from one another. Can you do cause and effect? Can you explain how the battles that happened here created this new party system? Can you also do continuity and change over time? When we move into this time period, can you explain what things change politically as our major issues, what things remain the same? And I had a number of people trying that out with their DBQs, where they were highlighting the idea that a civil rights movement would come later on in the future. The dilemma, though, with that essay point is in order for a contextualization to work, it's got to be running the same theme and the same point that your essay is working with. So your essay is focused on regional differences about slavery that created political tensions. When it comes to the battle over slavery, then, if you wanted to extend this essay to like Reconstruction, so where you have Northern and Southern battles over maintaining something that is similar to slavery, that is a super great post-contextualization. If you run this to the 1960s and you're trying to explain that in the civil rights movement, we also had racial issues, that's not this question. It's similar. It's got a similarity, but it's not really something that provides much context to what you see happening here. So for us, that's where I wanted to be for today, is giving you these tools. You have different thematic organizers. And like Sophia pointed out to you, you can open these up using the app called Cami, and then you can annotate these and mark them up like crazy. But these are your social movements that pop up throughout US history that could be then shown up as essay questions for your DBQ. Your next one that you have are wars. And when you think about your foreign policy essay questions that could pop up, being able to explain cause and effect, continuity and change over time, compare, contrast, you could easily get an essay question comparing and contrast what is going on with World War I compared to World War II. And when we think about these wars, think not just about what's happening militarily, think about what's happening on the home front. So when it comes to World War I, World War II, American Civil War, our economies get transformed as a result of the war itself. That would also be a major turning point. Lincoln's use of greenbacks here is going to create a massive boom when it comes to the Gilded Age, because we've got all this liquidity going on with our currency because we inflate our money supply. You've got economic issues that you could link over time. These are all your crashes and economic changes that happen over time that may be the focus of an essay question that you may not be strong with, because I find for my students, economic history is not one of the strong suits that most of my students have. And then finally, cultural movements over time, to give you a chance to refresh your memory about what trends you saw taking place. This would be the one that I would just eyeball quickly. I cannot imagine that this is going to be the big part of what's going to be happening with your AP test. Good question, Madeline. So if you take a look at our American AP US history pacing during the coronavirus shutdown Google document, I've got that located. Here in Schoology. Right here, underneath your turn-ins for the civil rights movement. And this is where I've been typing the lesson plans and also putting links for what we've been doing on a daily basis. So if you scan down the documents of today's lesson plans, you'll be able to find all of these links located here. Tomorrow, then, what I'm planning on doing with you guys is I'm planning on answering any questions you guys have. So if you look down this study chart and you're not certain what you should be noticing or thinking about, this is meant to be another shotgun blast of all sorts of different content that you may or may not be familiar with at this point or solid with. but it gives you a different way of looking at it. Rather than looking at it from textbook standpoint of chapter, 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 this is putting into one place all of the stuff that's related to a certain theme. When you come back to class tomorrow, then you'll have your DBQs graded. I'll be able to answer any sort of writing questions that you guys have. But then what we'll start moving into is specific elements of the DBQ. Especially what I'd like to highlight for you is contextualization, because that still seems to be something that is throwing off a lot of people in order to get that done. And a lot of people are struggling strictly because of the idea that when it comes to using contextualization, most kids will be able to bring in a fact from either before or after the time period that could be contextualized. But the contextualization is something you actually have to do. It's the so what element of explaining why does a reader need to know about this topic in order to be able to understand the writing that you're going to be doing in a deeper sort of fashion. So that's what I'm planning on doing for you tomorrow, is looking at DBQs, making sense out of contextualization, answering any questions you guys have, and continuing our review process. But this feels like I've put plenty onto your plate for today. These do not need to be done by tomorrow, though. So if you find that I've given you more than you can bite off in one day, especially if you find that your content knowledge isn't as strong as you want it to be, use these things as a starting point. And again, you should either print these, open them with Kami, try to put in details here and see what you can do from the top of your head. If you find from your top of your head you're not prepared to be able to fill out these sheets on your own, then start doing research and looking this stuff up. But keep in mind, the more often you have to keep looking stuff up, the more we really need to be concerned about how you're going to fix that over the next couple of weeks. Because if you're feeling that way now and we don't fix it, it's going to feel that way for the AP test, and it is going to get exposed when you start writing. And check my chat. Let me see. Where should we submit them? You are not submitting these guides. You are instead just looking them over to try to figure out if there's if you can make those links that I was describing. And I'll be answering questions for you as you look them over. So this is meant to be for your review purposes, to give you a different look at how this content could be assembled. And in particular, if you think about the essay question that we just worked through, my hope is that you don't need the points behind these to make them relevant, because if you had a solid handle on this essay question that we just ran through would have been a lot easier. And that's very much the way that I feel about all the DBQs. I'm very much not worried from the standpoint of you guys being abnormal. I am worried, though, when it comes to the DBQ. This is the hardest element of the AP test. That's why the College Board is giving this to you guys as your assessment. It's usually the thing that on a yearly basis, I'm working through this last, with the understanding that our kids would have already made a lot of gains with multiple choice, short answers, and whatever, that even if we were still struggling with this at the time of the AP test, we'd be okay. This is now what our entire score is dependent on, and we're doing it at a distance. So in particular, I'm assuming you guys already have the motivation you need, and looking through these topics and knowing that I'll reteach anything you need help with should hopefully be good enough motivation for us to be on top of that stuff. So I'm checking chat to see if there's any other questions. I do not see any at this time, but I'm going to hang out for a second. If you need anything else from me today, feel free to pop it into the chat. Feel free to dip out at this point, though. Fill out the attendance to make sure that you get credit for attending for today. And I will see you tomorrow at 8 a.m. Have a great day, guys. Thank you, guys. Have a great day.